Welcome to another video from McFatter Tech Musser. If you like these videos, please click subscribe. 70-740 Lesson 18, Maintaining Server Installations Part 2. In this section, we'll cover the remainder of our lesson, which is performing backup and restore operations using Windows Server Backup. So in a previous lesson, we installed Windows Server Backup and we did a simple backup to a network share. Well, using Windows Backup is much more than that. So let's start with the bottom line. When an organization loses data, the results can range from a loss of productivity to an entire meltdown of the company itself. Having a solid backup strategy along with the systems, processes, and tools to execute the strategy is the key to your ability to recover. Those two sentences are very clear, right? Well, you have to have a strategy and you have to be able to execute that strategy. Well, what does all that mean? At some point, you will have a failure, whether it's a hardware failure or a software failure or a cause due to human error or perhaps a computer virus or malware or theft, or as you can see also natural disaster. So what are we talking about? We're talking about the ability to recover when something goes wrong. This has to be part of what's called your BCP, your business continuity plan. Within that business continuity plan is your DR plan, your disaster recovery plan. Now, people think of disaster recovery plans and they think of catastrophic failures like flooding or earthquakes or hurricanes. But a DR plan has to be much, much more. Yes, it does need to plan for that hurricane and the eventuality and consequences of what happens because of that. But it also needs to include, what do you do when a hard drive fails? What do you do if a server fails? What do you do in the event of a application failure? This is all part of that disaster recovery plan. Most time, and I'm speaking from experience, companies and people don't take backup seriously until after something bad has happened. And then it's, oh, why haven't we planned for this? Why haven't we done this before? You need to plan how you're going to secure and protect that data before a loss occurs. You need to determine what needs to be backed up. How often are you going to do that backup, and what type of backup will it be? Are you going to store those backups somewhere within your facility that is on site? Or will it be in the cloud? This should all be part of your backup strategy. And overarching above all that, when we talk about where you're going to store those backups, you never store the backups in the same location as the data that's being backed up. You also have to consider the roles that are being performed by those servers on your network that you're backing up. Your Active Directory, your DHCP, your DNS, your web servers. Does it make sense to have a service fail and have to restore a full backup of that server, which could take hours and hours, or to simply restore a backup of the service? You also need to consider, what is the impact of running these backups? Backups take processing power. They utilize bandwidth. Do you want to schedule a full backup on multiple servers during your business hours? Or should they be best scheduled for off-peak hours? Fortunately, Windows Server does utilize something called volume shadow copy service. And those shadow copies create point-in-time snapshots And what this does is it allows you to minimize downtime because that snapshot is what gets backed up, not the actual running data. So you don't have to pause the access to your data to be able to back it up. Now, you say, well, we've got a RAID array or we've got a failover cluster. Well, what happens if the entire cluster is affected? What happens if the RAID array is affected? You have a RAID controller failure. These are all things that need to be planned for. They're not substitutes to performing backups. So let's take a look at how we can go about protecting your data and your servers using the simple backup feature that's provided with Windows Server. The command line tool that we install when we install Windows Server Backup is wbadmin. Just as I just said, it's a command line tool, and here you can see the options when you run wbadmin /?. When we install that backup feature, and keep in mind it is a feature, not a role, we also install the console that's available to us through our tools. And additionally, there's also Windows PowerShell commandlets. If we wish to install Windows Server Backup on a server core installation, we use PowerShell. And when you log into that Windows Server core, of course, you get the command prompt. You would type in PowerShell to enter PowerShell. And then you're going to use the import-module space server manager. That gives you the ability to then run the install-windows feature space windows-server-backup. If you wish to confirm whether Windows Server Backup is then installed or actually any feature or role, you can use this, would substitute the correct term. You would run a get-windows feature space a pipe, that's that vertical bar, another space, the word where, another space, curly bracket, $__name, space, -eq, space, and then in quotation marks, the feature or role that you want to see if it's installed, and then finally close it with another curly bracket. Now, Windows Server Backup. It gives us the ability to do a number of different types of backups. We can do a full backup, a full server backup that is, a bare metal recovery, a system state, a system reserve, and or local and remote volume backup capabilities. We need to consider two things: the recovery time objective, that's an RTO, and the recovery point objective, that's an RPO. The recovery time objective is how long are you allotted before you need to get that system back online. It is the maximum amount of time you have to bring a system back online before your organization begins to feel an impact from it. The recovery point objective, and this is sometimes called the point of no return. It's the amount of data you can afford to lose before there is a significant impact on your organization. So recovery time objective is recovering data. Recovery point objective is how much data are you willing to lose. So recovery time objective, again, this is your recovery time. How long are you given to do your recovery? The recovery point objective is how much data are you willing to lose. In other words, if you do a backup once per day and 30 minutes before your backup is scheduled to run, that's 23 and a half hours after your last backup, your system fails, then you are saying we're willing to lose up to 24 hours worth of data. Okay, let's move on. So with that, you need to determine how often are you going to perform that backup. Will it be weekly, daily, hourly? When will you perform that backup? Is it going to be every day? At what time of the day? Where are you going to store that backup? Is it going to be attached to the system on an external hard drive? Is it going to be to a remote share? Is it going to be to the cloud? Where? What are you going to back up? And not just what you will back up, but when will you back that up? Is it going to be a full system server backup? Is it going to be the system state, or going to be individual files, folders, volumes? We have to do that with the consideration of what we're going to use the backup for. Are we taking the backup expecting to have to do a full system recovery? Are we going to just recover the system state? Or are we doing this with the expectation of being able to do a bare metal recovery? We'll talk about bare metal recovery here in just a few more minutes. Make sure that you understand the following 7 bullet points that you need to keep in mind when working with Windows Server Backup. For example, backing up directly to a tape drive is not supported. Make sure you understand these 7 bullet points. For example, if you're backing up to a remote volume, for example, a shared folder, only one copy of the backup can be stored in the folder. So each time your backup run, it overwrites the previous backup. When we do our backup, we have 2 options to choose from. We can select full server or custom. Custom has a couple different options, as we can see here. The full server backup is recommended, and it backs up all hard drives except for the volume where that backup's stored. So if you designate one installed hard drive as your backup, that would not be included. Custom. Custom gives us the ability, we could do bare metal recovery, system state, system reserved, or an individual disk. The bare metal recovery. This gives you the ability to not only be able to restore that server, but to restore that server to different hardware. If a server's been running in your organization for many years and it fails, you may not have the option to restore it to the same hardware. That same hardware may not be available any longer. Now, do keep in mind that it needs to be to the same architecture. You cannot take an x64 64-bit backup and restore it to x86 32-bit architecture. You do need to use your installation media, the DVD, to start the recovery process. This gives you the ability to get into that bare metal recovery. The system state, this is utilized to back up all the files needed to recover Active Directory. It also includes registry, boot files. So if you want to do simply a backup of your Active Directory, pick System State. It also includes backing up the Active Directory Certificate Services database, your sysvol folder. So these are all things critical to be able to restore your Active Directory. The System Reserved, this is the area that contains your Windows recovery environment. This is what can be used to boot the server in situations when the operating system becomes corrupted or fails to boot. And of course, a local disk is a simple disk and volume on the server. Let's talk about scheduling options. We can do a scheduled backup. We also have the option to do a manual backup. It's a one-time backup. So you could schedule to do your full server backups for perhaps daily. And then you could also include manual backups periodically of perhaps a volume that's not included in your regularly scheduled backup. If you feel the need to make a backup outside of your current backup schedule, maybe you're going to do some type of maintenance that could have repercussions. So you want to do a backup first and not wait for the scheduled backup. Perhaps you want to store a backup in a different location. These are all the considerations for when you might do a manual backup. Now, we talked briefly about where we're going to store our backups. Well, there's 3 different options. You can back up to a hard disk, you can back up to a volume, you can back up to a shared network folder. Now, to a hard disk or a volume involves storing your backups locally on that server. Keep in mind that there are risks entailed with this. It might be faster. It might be your fastest option for running that backup, and it's not going to use any network bandwidth, but it's also going to be stored directly there on that server. If we back up to a shared network folder, this gives you the ability to store the backup in a different location. However, remember that you can only have one backup at a time. Each time your backup runs, it will overwrite the previous backup. Okay, so let's take a look and see what is the folder and file structure that's created. When your backup starts, backup creates a folder structure at the target location. There's going to be a parent folder named Windows Image Backup. Within that, there'll be a subfolder with the name of the server. Within that, you're going to see additional files and folders as illustrated in these 5 bullet points. Now, optimizing your backups. This is what's called full versus incremental. Once you complete your first full backup, now keep in mind this only applies to storing locally, because if you do that backup to a shared folder, it makes a new backup every time. When you're using that local storage, after you complete the first full backup, you can then automatically run incremental backups. The incremental is only the data that's changed from the last backup. This is done by default. So it will create incremental backups that function much like full backups. And in that, it allows you to restore from a single backup. Now, previously, if you wanted to use a backup method like this, you would have had to restore your most recent full backup and then each incremental backup. No longer. It also uses block level technology and also the volume shadow copy service, that's VSS. The block level increases your performance because it bypasses the files and file systems. So in other words, it reads the blocks in the order they appear on the disk instead of reading them in the order of being a file. Because files can be fragmented all over your disk, right? By doing it in block order, it can be much faster. The VSS takes a snapshot of your current data, and that's what's used to back up the data. This is what allows our systems to continue to function during the backup. There are 3 different options for optimizing backup performance. Normal backup, which is your default. Faster, which indicates you're performing incremental backups. And then, of course, custom and allows you to select each volume individually for the backup performance. What about performing a manual backup of a local volume to a remote share, that one time? Well, here are the steps for doing that, and we did that in a previous lab. What about scheduling a backup? It's as simple as running the wizard and selecting backup schedule and then defining that schedule and the location for the backup. We talked about bare metal recovery. And as we stated, bare metal recovery allows us either to restore to that Windows server or different hardware. So if our server has crashed and we've repaired it, and we do not have the ability to log into Windows because we've done that restoration, but at this point Windows Server doesn't function, we can run our media and do a bare metal recovery to restore our server operation. Let's talk about determining backup strategies for different Windows Server roles and workloads. Here again, let's review the bottom line. The roles assigned to a server can dramatically impact its configuration, as well as the frequency and the type of backup needed to restore it in the future. When determining your backup strategy, you need to consider how often the data changes, whether that data can be replaced if it's lost, and how critical the data is. As part of your overall backup strategy, you need to take into consideration the roles installed on each of your servers. What if we're running DNS? What if we're running DHCP? What are the ways that we can back this up? Well, we can back up DHCP by simply accessing the console and selecting Action Backup. And like many of our backups, it is backed up to the %system root %/Windows /system32 and then the service name backup, as you can see on your screen. Windows System32 DHCP backup. DNS is a similar location. System32 DNS backup contoso.com DNS backup file. Now, this is a misprint. Windows should also be there. Make sure you understand these various commands for how you can run those backups. This applies to only DHCP and DNS. Backing up certificate services. Here again, it's also in the system root, Windows, System32, and then the cert log. Again, we can open up our certificate services console and go to All Task Backup CA. And it will be placed here. We can select that as our backup directory. It then creates that directory. Again, our service is now backed up. So we could create a special backup to back up anything in the System32 and below. This might give us the ability to restore those services. What about backing up our Active Directory? Well, it's critically important that we have that backup. This is where all our user and computer accounts are at. Our users and our computers can't authenticate to our domain if Active Directory is not running. If we do a system state backup, Active Directory is backed up as part of that. If we do a full backup, Active Directory is backed up as part of that. Keep in mind, restoring a system state takes much less time than restoring a full backup. And here you can see the 5 areas that are backed up as part of your Active Directory and the system state. If we wish to do a backup of the system state, it's as simple as doing these command line. wbadmin start backup, system state backup, and then specify a target. The quiet indicates that it should run in the background. What about backing up web servers? We need to make sure that we've got a copy of our web server configuration. All our web server files by default are stored underneath the inetpub folder on your C drive. The default website would be www.root. Other website directories would be listed beside that. The configuration for IIS is stored here again in your Windows /System32/INET-SRV. So not only do your websites need to be backed up, but also your System32/INET-SRV directory. You would want to back up all your website files that are in those folders. You'd want to back up and export all your IIS certificates. And of course, back up your IIS configuration. Now, the configuration can be backed up with a command prompt, switching to your INET-SRV folder, and then use the appcmd, the app command, add backup, and then the name of your backup. If you need to restore that configuration, you would use the app command restore backup and then the name of your backup. Many different ways to have a backup and restoration of your services. Now, we talked about VSS. Well, there's also a VSS admin command line tool, and it can be used to manage your VSS, your volume shadow copy service. Make sure that you have a good understanding of VSS and its components before you try to take a look at how that tool works. There are a number of different components: the VSS requester, the VSS writer, the VSS provider, of course the source volume, which is the data that you want to copy, and then the storage volume, which is where you're going to copy to. Make sure you understand what each one of these things does and this basic overview of how it interacts. We can manage it. We can see a list of options. We can list the writers, list the providers, list existing shadow copies, list the volumes that are eligible for shadow copies. Using shadow copies for shared volumes. Shadow copies for shared volumes, that's SCSV, and Hyper-V snapshots provide you with the ability to return to a specific point in time. Understand that shadow copies for shared volumes, it uses VSS to capture and store copies of files and folders that are located on shared network resources at a specific point in time. When it's implemented on a volume, not only administrators but also end users can recover accidentally deleted or overwritten files. They can also compare different versions of the same files. Now, because of the fact that we give the end users the ability to do this, it can dramatically reduce not only the time but the associated costs with having to recover a folder and file. They don't have to call you. They can simply just right-click on the folder and select the file and recover it. If they accidentally overwrite a file, they could right-click on the file and select a previous version before the overwrite. If you want to enable it, you need to create a shared folder. You would then go into Computer Management. You would select Disk Management, and then you'd select the properties for that disk. And under the Shadow Copies tab, you'd have to select Enabled. And here you can see that C is disabled, E is disabled. If you wish to have shadow copies enabled, you would select the drive and select Enabled. Now, we can also back up Hyper-V hosts and virtual machines. Remember, they're stored as files on your hard disk. And those files are your VHDs, your saved state files, snapshots, configuration files. Because of the fact that they're stored on a volume on your server, your Windows Server Backup can be used to protect them in combination with the VSS. We can take a checkpoint of a virtual machine, but remember, that's not a substitute for a backup. If you're going to back up your Hyper-V host, it's recommended that you do a full server backup. Keep in mind, this can be very, very large, so you're going to have some very large storage requirements as far as where you're going to store that backup. You're going to be backing up all your virtual machines, your virtual hard disks, those snapshots. It can be very large, so make sure you plan for that eventuality. Not just what you're doing today, but where your storage requirements might be a year, 2 years, or 3 years from now. In this lesson, which was a very long lesson, we learned about the fact that we need to have a way to be able to keep our systems up to date. And we use our Windows Server Update services to do that, and have a reporting mechanism as well, so that you as the administrator get reporting and can see the state of all your devices on your network, and not relying on the users to update their machines, whereas you can provide that. WSUS gives us a centralized server that makes all this possible. We can use Windows Defender to protect our systems against viruses, spywares, and other types of malware. And it does this using real-time protection. In the world of cybersecurity, Windows Defender is known as an IPS, an intrusion prevention system. It can notify you when something bad is occurring. It can also take actions to correct it. Finally, we looked at backups and the fact that if you lose data, the results can be anywhere from a simple loss of productivity to the entire meltdown of the company itself. Planning for and having a solid backup and restore strategy, along with all the systems, processes, and tools to do it, that is executed, is the key to your ability to recover. Now, one thing they did not discuss in here, having all the backups needed to recover your systems is great, but you also have to have confidence in those backups. So you also need to test them. Make sure that when the day comes that you need to restore a backup, it will function. You need to test your backups. You might want to do this in a lab environment. This way you don't have to take a server offline to be able to test it. This concludes 70-740 Lesson 18. I hope you enjoy this. WSUS is one of the core technologies that I see as absolutely critical in maintaining an organization. As we state every time, I'll see you in the next lesson or lab. Have a great one.